Iisus, Jesús, Jésus, Yesu, Jesus,
Yasuo. Every language today has their own way of saying the name Jesus. But how was it pronounced in the first century? Or how did Jesus and his followers pronounce his name? I remember many years ago encountering all sorts of websites that said we shouldn't use the name Jesus, it's a corruption of Zeus, or we shouldn't use the name Jesus and we should go back to the original Hebrew of the name, and they all had different pronunciations of what that might be. Now, many years later, it turns out that my field of research is actually how they pronounced Hebrew in the Roman period, 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, based on how it's reflected in Greek writing. So I actually have the tools to get at this question myself. And so I thought I would make a video to clear up some of the misinformation out there and answer the question, how would Jesus have pronounced his own name? And how did it come to be pronounced the way it is in English? Spoiler, it has nothing to do with Zeus. Now, the name of Jesus of Nazareth is recorded for us in the Greek New Testament as Jesus. So the first question we have to answer is, what is the Hebrew name underlying the Greek name Jesus? Since this, of course, is a Greek version of a Hebrew name and not the Hebrew name itself. Well, if you look at the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the earliest parts of which were translated about 200 or more years before Jesus of Nazareth was born, you will find that the name Jesus appears almost 250 times. In every case, it corresponds with one of two names, Yehoshua, which in English Bibles is translated as Joshua, or Yeshua, which in English Bibles is translated as Jeshua. Now, just a quick note, for now I'm using the modern Hebrew pronunciation as we go through these names, but we'll talk more later about exactly how these were pronounced in the 1st century. Now, for an ancient Hebrew speaker, these were really just two different versions of the same name. Yehoshua was the more original and longer form of the name, and Yeshua was a shorter and later form of the name. Indeed, in the early books of the Hebrew Bible, like the Torah, the stories we read about Moses and Joshua, the name you find is Yehoshua. It is not actually until some of the later books of the Bible, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles, where we find the shorter form, Yeshua. So it seems that the shorter form did not actually develop until a later stage of the language, probably around the time of or after the exile in the 6th century BCE. Now, after the shorter form had developed, both names existed side by side, and you might even think of Yehoshua and Yeshua as something like Joshua and Josh. But it's not entirely clear if one person would have been called by both names in different contexts. It's hard to know from the evidence that we have. Maybe one person would have just had one of those names. So then, which of these two names, Yehoshua or Yeshua, or both, was likely the name of Jesus of Nazareth? Well, to answer this question, we have to turn to some inscriptions and papyri from the time and place in which Jesus was born, grew up, and lived. The name Yehoshua, whether in Hebrew or Aramaic, does not actually appear very often in inscriptions from Judea-Palestine. There are a couple examples I could find, but both date from the 3rd century CE or later. So here's one you can see from, I believe, around the coastal area, from the 3rd, 5th century CE. Here's another one from, Judea, Idumea area from the 4th to 8th century CE, so it's not very common in the epigraphic record. Now, the name Yeshua, on the other hand, appears many times, maybe around 15, and almost all of them are dated to the 1st century. So you can see here's some inscriptions of Yeshua from Jerusalem and Judea in the 1st century. Also some from Idumea, Judean desert region as well. And then also in a collection of papyri letters and contracts from around the Dead Sea, from around the early 2nd century, so we're talking around year 100, 110, 120, 130 or so, we don't find the name Yehoshua at all, but we do find the name Yeshua about 9 times. So you can see here it is in one papyrus. Here it is again in another papyrus. And in these contracts from around the Dead Sea, you often find a Greek version of the contract and then a short version of the contract and or some signatures of those involved written in Aramaic. So these give us a good chance to see the coordination of the names. And in each case, the name Jesus, or a variant Yesuos, is in the Greek version of the contract, and that will correspond to Yeshua in the Hebrew name or the Aramaic version of the contract. As you can see, for example, here you get Vesas Yesu, a slight variant in the declension, but still the same basic shape as Jesus. And in the Aramaic section of the contract, Besa Bar Yeshua. So it seems pretty safe to say that the Hebrew underlying the name Jesus in the New Testament is Yeshua rather than Yehoshua, since the former was just so much more common in this period of the 1st century, 2nd century Roman period than the other. And in fact, I think this is probably what is going on in the Septuagint as well. It's not that Jesus in the Pentateuch is a true transcription of the name Yehoshua for Joshua, but it is regarded as the Greek equivalent of the name, familiar to those speakers of Hebrew and Aramaic living in the Hellenistic period. After all, many Jews interacting with Greek on a regular basis would have had a Greek version of their name alongside the Hebrew version of their name to use in Greek-speaking contexts. Now, the Greek version of the name is clearly based off of the form Yeshua, which was much more popular in the Hellenistic period. It wasn't based on Yehoshua, since its phonological structure corresponds as much as it could to Yeshua. There's an initial iota corresponding to the y sound, an eta corresponding to the long e sound, a sigma corresponding to Hebrew sh, and then an omicron ypsilon corresponding to the Hebrew long u vowel. And then finally, you just add the Greek nominal inflection on to the end of the name, and you have it. But a name like Yehoshua, if it was truly transcribed into Greek, would look different. And we know this because there was actually a tradition of transcribing the Hebrew Bible, and not just names, into Greek later on in the Roman period. And in that tradition, the name Yehoshua ends up being written as Yosue. So now that we have determined that Greek Jesus ultimately corresponds to Hebrew Yeshua, there are just a couple pronunciation questions we have to point out about the 1st century pronunciation of Hebrew. First, unlike modern Hebrew, which does not have long and short vowels and only has a single e vowel, Hebrew of the 1st century had 2 e vowels, one long and one short. And it's probably the case that the longer one was pronounced with a slightly more tense pronunciation. So something like e was the long one, and that's what's represented by Greek eta, and then eventually the vowel sign tsere in the Tiberian tradition of Hebrew. And then the short e vowel is more like eh. And then the final u vowel is also pronounced long, even though we don't have long vowels in modern Hebrew. Now the last remaining question concerns what is written as ayin in Hebrew. Historically, ayin was pronounced as ah, as a guttural. It's not a sound we have in English. Now, over time, already starting in the ancient period, these types of sounds, the gutturals, started to fade away. As they got weaker in pronunciation, sometimes vowels would be added to preserve their pronunciation better. In the Tiberian tradition of Hebrew, and in modern Hebrew, for example, a short ah vowel is added just before the final ah to make sure it is pronounced. That is why in modern Hebrew we say Yeshua. Now, this weakening of gutturals was going on during the 1st century, so we have to ask the question, was Jesus' name pronounced as Yeshua, with the final guttural strongly pronounced, Yeshua, or as Yeshu, with weakening and not pronouncing the final guttural, or as something like Yeshua, with a helping vowel to help pronounce the ah, or maybe just as Yeshua, as kind of a hint that there was a guttural there. So what was likely the case in Nazareth, in the Galilee, where Jesus grew up? Well, the weakening of the gutturals in the Second Temple period is generally thought to have been brought about by Greek influence, which means it would have impacted urban areas and the educated classes first and foremost. And there's a number of scholars who've written on this, Kucher for one, and then Uri more recently. Now in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is in the south in Judea, there is clear evidence for the weakening of gutturals, where guttural letters will be omitted or written in the wrong place. The same is true of some inscriptions from Judea around the same time. Most of our epigraphy from Galilee, however, comes from a later date. At that point, there are two groups. Inscriptions from Beit She'an, Tiv'on, and Haifa show a lot of guttural weakening. But other inscriptions show very little guttural weakening. This is confirmed by rabbinic literature. There's a number of passages relevant here. And given that these were near Greek centers, especially Bet She'an, this is consistent with the hypothesis outlined earlier that Greek influence is responsible for the weakening of gutturals. In other inscriptions from Galilee that were not under heavy Greek influence, weakening of gutturals is minimal. Now, given Jesus' background, then, growing up in a rural village of, who knows, maybe 500, 1,000 people in Nazareth, it is unlikely that his version of Hebrew or Aramaic would have been heavily influenced by Greek. Therefore, he probably pronounced the guttural ein as aw. It is thus most likely that when Jesus, his family, and his disciples said his name, they pronounced it as Yeshua. When he traveled to other places, however, for example, the Decapolis, it is possible that those more heavily influenced by Greek pronounced his name as Yeshu. In Jerusalem, where there would have been both Greek and Hebrew, Aramaic in heavy supply, the guttural might have weakened but not elided entirely. Those residents might have pronounced it, but with a helping vowel, as Yeshua. Indeed, we actually find two pieces of epigraphic evidence that support this point. In a first century inscription from Jerusalem, we find the name spelled as Yeshua in Hebrew with a final hey, indicating an ah vowel, and as Yeshua in Greek on the same inscription. This almost certainly indicates something of a helping vowel to help pronounce the ein sound. And from the early 2nd century, we find the name spelled as Yeshua with a final aleph after the ein in a papyrus from around the Dead Sea. And we know that Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek were all strong in that area in the 1st and 2nd centuries. So it is probably the case that all three pronunciations, Yeshu, Yeshu, and Yeshua, existed in the 1st century. But when Jesus, his family and friends and disciples from his region pronounced his name, it was probably with a strong ah, as Yeshu. So how do we get to the form in English? Well, let's do this quick and wrap up the video. Well, the Hebrew form Yeshu goes into Greek as Jesus. This gets picked up into Latin as Jesus, which eventually comes into English as Jesus, since Latin I before vowels often ends up as J in English. Nothing to do with Zeus, just normal language development. Not every language, however, got the name Jesus through Greek. Take a look at Arabic, which pronounces the name as Yasur, keeping the final ein sound. So, if you speak a language other than English, maybe you can explain in the comments down below how to pronounce the name Jesus in your own language, and maybe think of how it ended up being pronounced that way from the original Hebrew Yeshua going to the Greek Jesus, and so on, or perhaps another way.